to say it's Friday, it's New York City, you could have been anywhere, so I'm so happy that you're here with us at the Schomburg. So I'm going to give a quick welcome about what the Schomburg is about, and then I'd like to introduce our co-sponsor for this evening. But let me ask you, is there anyone here who tonight is their first time being at the Schomburg? Yes! And of course, everyone here has been here before. So thank you so much. And what about any Schomburg Society members? Do we have any of those? Oh, yes. So for those of you who didn't raise your hands, the Schomburg Society is our membership program. It's how we support having free programs for tonight. And for the people who know and for the new people who are here, I like to always say a little bit of what the Schomburg Society, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture is about. I like to think of the Schomburg as being a watering hole for people who are thirsty to learn about the history and the culture of people of African descent, which we've been collecting here for over 85 years. So whether it's photos and prints, or rare books and manuscripts, moving images and recorded sound, arts and artifacts, you can all find it here at the Schomburg. So thank you for coming to this program tonight. I also like to remind people that the Schomburg is what I like to call a powerhouse of exhibitions and free programs like the one we're having this evening. So without further ado, welcome again to the Schomburg, and I'd like to introduce to you LaShawn Warren, who's the Vice President of Policy Development and Programming of the American Constitution Society.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. We're so excited to be a part of this program, and we're excited to come down from Washington, D.C. to partner with the Schomburg Center. So thank you for coming. I hope you all were able to pick up a Constitution that's outside on the table with ACS on it. We greatly value the Constitution, and we take every opportunity to pass that out at all of our events. So for those of you who are not familiar with the American Constitution Society, we're a national network of lawyers, law students, judges, and policymakers who believe that the law should be a force to improve the lives of people. ACS works for positive change by shaping debate on vitally important legal and constitutional questions. And it is our mission to ensure the fundamental principles of human dignity, genuine equality, individual rights and liberties enjoy their rightful and central place in American law. Bayard Rustin embodied these ideals, and we are thrilled tonight to join the Schomburg Center to co-host this event, to discuss Rustin's not only his legacy, but also his mission to turn civil rights into human rights. Bayard Rustin did not view civil rights through the lens of black or white, male or female, but rather he saw all human beings as entitled to a decent education, decent employment, decent housing, and the right to participate in the political process. Rustin teaches us that positive change does not come easily. Late in his life, Rustin became fond of repeating a maxim that struggle is continuous and freedom never a final act. When asked how he remained ever hopeful, Rustin said he learned a great lesson from the Bible. God does not require us to achieve any of the good tasks that humanity must pursue, he said. What God requires of us is only that we not stop trying. This evening, we are fortunate to hear from a panel of scholars and experts who can speak to this country's continuing struggle to enforce civil rights and to remedy our social and economic inequalities. To facilitate this conversation, we are pleased to be joined by Kathy Albisa. Kathy is the Executive Director of the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, which she co-founded in order to build legitimacy for human rights in general and economic and social rights in particular here in the United States. Please join me in welcoming Kathy and our distinguished guest.
Well, thank you for coming out. This is a great topic of conversation because I think we can all start from a point of agreement that Bayard Rustin was amazing. He was a fascinating, gifted, extraordinary human being. He was larger than life while still deeply human. He struggled with the ethos of his time and still played a crucial role in social justice effort after social justice effort. He really lived up to that notion that the struggle is continuous, and he never stopped struggling, politically or personally. He's an extraordinary example of what an activist should be. He suffered for being a gay man at a time when gay men and lesbian women were persecuted for their sexuality. And I think from what I've read, some of the greatest suffering may not even have come from what his enemies threw at him, but what his friends threw at him. You know, for accusations that he was betraying the movement for nothing more than being who he was. And yet he managed to stay true to himself and stay true to the movement. He was an extraordinary human being. He was courageous, and he breathed and lived this radical notion of militant nonviolence, of radical nonviolence, terms that almost seem in contradiction with themselves, but for him represented nothing short of transformation. He saw it as the only path to transforming a society that was sick with division, sick with hatred, sick with exclusion and poverty, and he saw human rights as the cure, and radical and militant nonviolence as the treatment. As I said, he was an extraordinary man. It's an honor, one that was making me very nervous this morning, to moderate this panel, so I'll just put that out there. Both because of the extraordinary person we're discussing, this amazing place that holds such a special place in our history and in our movements, and these incredible panelists, all who together have so many intellectual gifts that I'm afraid the room might explode at some point. So it is an honor to commemorate Bayard Rustin with these co-panelists and to have you here. The format, just to let you know how this is going to go, is we have a series of questions for the panelists, which they may answer, or they may decide to just, knowing who we have here, tell us what they want us to hear. But we do have a series of questions in the hope that we have a conversation among these extraordinary people. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about them before we start, in case for some reason beyond my comprehension you already don't know who they are. So we have Professor Bert Newborn, who is the applause welcome and appropriate. He's Ines Milla Holland, which I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, Professor of Civil Liberties and founding legal director of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. He knows that the struggle is continuous because for 45 years, he's been one of our nation's foremost civil liberties lawyers. He was the national legal director at the ACLU from '81 to '86, my first job. The special counsel to the now Legal Defense and Education Fund from '90 to '96. He was a member of the New York City Human Rights Commission from '88 to '92, and he's argued far more than a few Supreme Court cases and litigated hundreds of state and federal constitutional challenges. He currently directs the legal program at the Brennan Center, especially its effort to reinforce American democracy, a topic that could not be more timely, and secure campaign finance reform. The Brennan Center was established to honor, in '94, to honor Justice William Brennan Jr.'s monumental contribution to American law. Professor Newborn has a national reputation as a scholar, a teacher, but he's also an activist and a visionary, and we're very glad to have him here.
It's more applause than I've gotten in years.
Put me on your, anything.
I was going to say, that's more applause than I've gotten in years. So thank you very, very much.
Dr. Ida E. Jones is a historian, and what would we do without our historians? There's so much we have to learn from history and from them. She's a native of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and is currently the national director for the Association of Black Women Historians. She's the assistant curator of the manuscripts in the Moreland Spingarn Research Center. That's so impressive I can't pronounce it. And is a member of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. She's a graduate of Howard University, has a BA in journalism, a PhD in American history, and her field of study is African American history, women, religion, and historic records. So she's wide interest, and she's going to give us a very keen perspective of Bayard Rustin today, and knows his work. Professor Kendall Thomas, well, I'll start with the most important fact about him. He was my law professor my first year of law school in Columbia in 1986. He is the Nash Professor of Law at Columbia Law School and the co-founder and director at the Center for the Study of Law and Culture at Columbia University. I'm going to go off script for a minute because he was my first year law professor, and I can tell you even then he was pretty new then, it was 1986, and even then everyone knew Kendall Thomas was going to push the boundaries at the law school. He challenged everyone's thinking, and it took us about an entire semester to even understand where he was trying to take us. But we all admired how courageous he was in promoting views in institutions that frankly are not always on the cutting edge of social movement thinking. And so he was an important presence for us there. His teaching and research interests include constitutional law, human rights, feminist legal theory, critical race theory, and law and sexuality. His writings have appeared in academic journals, volumes of collected essays, and he is a co-editor of Critical Race Theory, The Key Writings That Form the Movement, and What's Left of Theory, New Work on the Politics of Literary Theory. He was an inaugural recipient of the Berlin Prize Fellowship of the American Academy in Berlin, and a member of the Special Committee on the American Center in Paris. He's chaired 2 sections of the Association of American Law Schools, and is a founding member of the Majority Action Caucuses of ACT UP, Sex Panic, and the AIDS Prevention Action League. He is a former member and vice chair of the board of directors of the Gay Men's Health Crisis. So he has always been an extraordinary scholar, but also a committed activist, and we're very glad to have him here. Okay, so with that, we're going to be asking our panelists some questions and hope that they can discuss it amongst themselves, as they say. The first one is, as we know, during the civil rights movement, there was enormous resistance to what the movement was trying to achieve and promote racial equality. There was even deeper and more vicious resistance to broader notions of social, political, and economic equality, especially as it intersected with racial equality. There's, just to cite a historian, Carol Anderson's book, Eyes Off the Prize, chronicles how the civil rights movement had to sort of back up a little bit on economic and social rights because the backlash was so severe. The question is, do you think America is ready now? How would you each describe the unfinished business of the movement, and what do you think we can accomplish today? And what would Bayard have to say? Don't all jump in at once.
I'll jump in. I wish I could say yes, but I don't believe it. Through the lens that I tend to work in, even if I did believe it, I think the political structure of the country is such that it would frustrate efforts at greater equality. Any political system that has ceded control of the speech to the richest, most entrenched groups in the country can't really hope for much in terms of political organization by the poor and the weak. So we've got a double problem, I think, and I hope the panelists will talk me off this, because I would love to feel more optimistic about what I'm going to say. I think we're still fighting the backlash that you mentioned. The civil rights movement was a unique moment in time. I was saying that I wish I'd known then what I know now, that what I was living through in the 60s when I was working on the movement was this unique moment in time when there was a sense that we really could touch the problems of fundamental inequality that deal with race and gender, that deal with sexual orientation, that deal with poverty. And we believed that we could do something about it, something real, something meaningful. And a great deal of progress was made. I don't want to suggest that the progress wasn't made, but we hit a stone wall. We hit a wall at some point in which there was a counter-reaction both from the very comfortable in the country who didn't want to see equality continue, and a counter-reaction from people who were frightened about others with different color skin, about others with different origins than theirs. And that counteraction set off a long period of political darkness. I don't think we can say it any other way. We've gone through a very, very long period where it's been almost unthinkable to make progress. We've been trying to hold on to what we were able to establish in the 60s and early 70s and not lose even that. But the idea of going even further is hard to imagine at this point. And I actually think if Mr. Rustin were here, I used to call him Mr. Rustin. I absolutely could never call him by his first name. But if Mr. Rustin were here, he said in 1965 that it's time to get out of the streets and get into politics. I think if he were here now, he would say it's time to reinforce politics by going back into the streets. Because the organization of power, I think, has to come from the bottom. It has to come from underneath, and it has to come from concerned people who simply refuse to accept the political realities that the system imposes at the top. And only until we can rebuild that movement, until we rebuild that movement, I don't think we're going to make a great deal of progress. And so I hate to sound such a pessimist, but that's unfortunately what I believe. That does not warrant applause. That warrants shocked silence and anger.
Well, that was the ripple of the shock and the anger that's coming. As a historian, I have to look at this from the origins in which this country was founded. We cannot divorce the civil rights movement from the way in which African Americans were introduced to this hemisphere by enslavers. So as a result, the civil rights movement was simply not the cause, but simply the result of an infectious self-disillusionment with the government that was created. White men that had no property, white women that had no property, or simply were women, were not allowed to be included in the idea of what the confederation of the government was going to be. So we see these episodes throughout the 19th century and the 20th century where people take from the politics to the street and vice versa. So I think in looking at the civil rights movement, clearly we're not able to discuss these issues because we've never addressed the initial self-delusion in the first place, that Africans were brought to this country as property for the sole purpose of the exploitation of that top percent or 1%, as you'd like to call it. And we've allowed that disillusionment to go along with more frosting on this non-existent cake. So as a result, we're talking in circles about something we've never really addressed. We're talking about symptoms, not the disease. So in short, I think in light of various situations that have happened both in Florida nationally as well as internationally, the conversation is being forced into a generation that never had to deal with this. You know, my generation, the Xers, the Ys, millennials, however you want to call them, didn't see white and colored signs. We grew up in a multicultural world in which everyone was equal, drink your milk and you can be Superman, or you can be the president one day. So we were also brought into this disillusionment on some level and now have children. And some of the skeletons or the ghosts of the past are now coming into our consciousness and affecting how we interact and engage. So at the end of the day, what needs to happen is a serious conversation that I think John Hope Franklin and Bill Clinton initially started this conversation about race, but that was on paper. We cannot really change mindsets, and even Mr. Rustin has in one of his articles talks about the idea that even though the law has changed, you can't change the de facto reality in which we engage. So that needs to be a way in which we address the real of this. Clearly, we can't change everybody's mind. There's not a switch we can just flick on and see the world in some kind of ubiquitous equality. But I do think in light of his own evolution, Rustin speaks about his grandmother and the Society of Friends or the Quakers as being a moral compass for him, and that's what kept him steady. And I think we've also lost some of that individual morality that we all need to have, whether it be Christian, Judeo-Christian, Catholic, whatever you want to call it, whatever faith belief you're working with, that there's a lack of moral compass that does not really chart our human destiny, our interconnectedness. And in just revisiting the Friends very briefly, they have the whole concept of the inner and outer world. And so I think that Rustin understood his inner world had changed, so he was going to manufacture that in the outer world. And I think if individuals were to evolve, beyond simply self and understand the interconnectedness of our humanity, then we would see a better society. And ideally, that's what America's supposed to be, at least on paper. But, and we're working towards it, clearly. And we can watch documentaries and see that there's been movement. But I think because it has been superficial, that the root is still festering underneath the ground, even though the tree has been cut down.
Well, I'm going to do something which is every panel organizer's worst nightmare and push back on the question. I'm not sure that the most productive question for purposes of the discussion we want to have this evening is whether America is ready for expanding the conversation around questions of equality, or as I prefer, freedom and justice, to encompass questions of political and social and economic justice and freedom. And so the question I would want to ask is, why is that the case, right? Why is it the case that the United States is unique, really, among most of the developed democracies in the absolute repudiation of notions of citizenship that go beyond an understanding of citizenship as being about civil and political rights? If you look in Europe, if you look in South America, if you look in many other places on the globe, you see the development of understandings and practices of citizenship and freedom that include economic citizenship, that include social citizenship, that go beyond political citizenship. So the question for me is, why has that failed to happen in the United States? Well, I do believe that part of the explanation has to do, as Professor Newborn suggested, with the character of our political system. But I think more fundamentally, part of the problem is with the nature of our economic system itself, right? So there's a connection between the inability to think about substantive citizenship as embracing social and economic rights, and the fact that we live in a neoliberal capitalist system in which the very way that we imagine what politics is and can be is constrained and constricted by commodity capitalism. So I detect a silence in the audience because the common sense is that capitalism lost in '89, right? That socialism lost in '89, that capitalism has conquered the globe. The fall of the Berlin Wall meant the triumph of capitalism, and the question that remained was, how do we extend, right, capitalism across the globe? But if you look in the domestic context at such decisions as the Supreme Court's decision a few terms ago in the Citizens United case, and if you simply observe this current presidential election cycle, you can see the capture of politics, not just by money, but by the very logic of the market, right? And when voting for most American citizens takes the primary form of voting for people who are singing on TV, right? The very possibility of a politics that embraces economic justice and social justice is very elusive and almost impossible to imagine. So I think the challenge is to ask ourselves, what sorts of work would be necessary to help Americans imagine a broader possibility for democracy than we are currently able to even dream?
Let me first applaud. That's worth saying. I have a sense, I agree with you on so many levels, but I want to not push back so much, but suggest that it's not just the ethos of commodity capitalism that is putting a lid on our capacity to imagine who we can be, but it's a kind of libertarian ethos that can sometimes be very good. I mean, you know, I headed the legal program at the ACLU. I can't tell you how many times I told the Supreme Court, hate government, fear government. It's a bad thing. It's coming in the night, and it's going to take your rights away. And that's the way, that's the rhetoric that you would use to protect free speech, to protect privacy, to protect the Fourth Amendment, to protect all these things. Now, that rhetoric has power. And what's happened is the right has taken that rhetoric and turned it and said, hey, you're right. The government's under your bed and it's going to take your First Amendment rights, but it's also going to take your property. And it's also going to take everything else. So we have to get rid of government. When you get rid of government and push it out, as we've been talking about nothing else since 1980, our politics have been essentially dominated by the question of, can we mug government, get it into a bathtub, and drown it? I mean, that's basically what the right has tried to do. When you get rid of government, you create a vacuum. There's going to be power everywhere. Governmental power, when you push it out, something creeps in. And what creeps in usually are very large concentrations of private power that substitute for what used to be public power. Now, sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's a bad thing, but our rhetoric is so, I don't think there's another country in the world that has the hate rhetoric that we direct, not just at each other, but at the idea of our government. That the government is to be feared, not respected. It's to be laughed at because it's fundamentally inefficient. When's the last time you heard a television program about what government does right? All you hear is a steady thing of government failure. And we on the left, I think, have not done a particularly good job in pushing back and explaining what the role of government must be, even in a commodity capitalist world. Because you can have a commodity capitalist world like the commodity capitalist world of France, or the commodity capitalist world of labor England, or even Germany, which is a deeply regulated economy. You can have that kind of commodity capitalist world, and you get better results than the kind of neo-Dickensian world that they're trying to build. There was an exchange in the Supreme Court on the health stuff, on the health care arguments this week that was so astonishing it took my breath away. I can't remember whether it was Scalia or Alito was pushing the Solicitor General around and asking him hard questions. And the Solicitor General said, look, the real problem is that unless we have this health insurance mandate, then who's going to pay for the problem of the uninsured person who comes to the hospital and says, I don't have any money, but you have to treat me anyway? So that person becomes what's known as a free rider. That person gets a free ride, never bought insurance, never bought into the system, but he comes to the hospital and you have to treat him. They said, well, wait a minute, you guys created that problem. The liberals created that problem. You're telling the hospital that they have to treat him. Let him die on the street. That's the kind of world that they envision. They envision a world of such libertarian purity that we would let people die on the street rather than have government reach out and help them. And now it seems to me that left people have got to pick that up and push back as hard as possible, because that's an argument we win. People will not buy a government that lets people die on the street. And that's what we need to be pushing back on.
Can I play devil's advocate on that? I'm not sure that they would consciously want people to die on the streets, but I think when people don't see it as part of their cloistered community, then it's not my problem. And as a result, since that person doesn't look like me or think like me or relate to me, whoever me is, thank you 1980s once again, the me idea, then why should I care? I think there was a situation in Washington, D.C., where a woman was attacked on a bus. Everybody watched this. She was in her 60s, the woman was in her 30s, and the bus driver sat and watched, the passenger sat and watched, and she was beaten. And nobody lifted a finger. Now, the cameras got it, And eventually the police were able to arrest the assailant. But this is in a predominantly black community with predominantly black passengers, possibly a black bus driver. So you're thinking, okay, there's some sense of community there. Well, we have stratification within subclasses now. And as a result of the stratifications, whether it be age, gender, orientation, whatever you want to call it, they're so insular that I don't see your problem as mine, or if I have to pay for your health and that diminishes my income, and so you're a burden, so maybe it's best you just simply disappear. Or we harvest you for organs and then help somebody else to live. So it becomes a very situation, and this goes back to what I think Mr. Rustin would talk about in regards to the moral fiber that we all should have, in which we see ourselves as connected. Because if I simply want to see your demise and or don't care about it, then when I now have to go before the court, the Hunger Games, here we go. So it's really, art is really, and life is mimicking art, and art's mimicking life. So I think we have to really seriously question moral questions, but then look at history. The 19th century was such a place in which government was pretty much puppeteered by businesses and capitalists, who then could now legislate by force of the dollar who gets justice, what is justice, who's a human, who's not human, who has rights, who doesn't have rights. So that language has been here before, and we kind of look at it as, oh, that was yesterday, it can't be that narrow again. It is going back to that narrowness.
But I do think that we're onto something really.
Ask the next
Oh, I'm
question.
sorry. The next question already?
And then you can answer any way you want.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure that the audience didn't lose hold of these two ideas that have just emerged. One, the question of libertarianism as the dominant way that people are imagining themselves as members of the American body politic. And two, the force of neoliberalism, in which politics cannot be thought about except in relationship to the governing logic of the economy and markets. That's important stuff.
It is, and Mr. Rustin, now I'll never be able to call him anything else either, at one point said that change was the result of a determined and persistent insistence that a vision of a better world shall be to some extent realized. And I think what you all are touching on is this need for a vision, that the vision we now currently have of society are these two, this toxic intersection of these two pieces that you've just discussed, so that your conclusion here is America is not ready, but we need to make it ready. That it's our responsibility, as Mr. Rustin would have said, to make it ready. And that in fact it might be a time of protest so that we can build some politics and not push back, but push forward.
And I think he would say that what I want to hear from you is how we make it ready, because you're depressing me more and more and more, and I want to be able to go home tonight and take only one drink. So I want to know how we get ourselves out of the moral trough that we've fallen into. But Mr. Rustin would say you get out of it two ways. You get out of it two ways. The most important way you get out of it, and this is the amazing, I think, lesson of his life. The most important is that you accept a personal responsibility yourselves to live that life. And that example, it's the example of great people who live the life that is probably the most important moral communicative force that we as human beings have. And so that, often we lose that when we have these discussions, that the responsibility starts inside. It starts with each of us. But then if you live that life, if you worry about the way you deal with your family, with your friends, with your children, with your co-workers, and you try to live that life with them, then the question is, how do we now generalize it? How do we move it to a larger number of people, to the point where it actually can affect the horizon of imagination that we have? And there I would love to hear what the two of you say about it. I mean, I teach it, I speak about it, but I have this sense that it's not enough, and I would love to know where we go from here, to try to get people to imagine that there can be a better place.
All right, so let's think about, because this is co-sponsored by the American Constitutional Society, we have a disproportionate number of lawyers on the panel. So let's think about that relationship between law and social movements. But also, I'll add something to the question here before you push back on it. And also sort of economic structures and social movements. So many organizers, many people who dedicate their lives to building social movements often say that law tends to follow movements rather than precede them. That legal interventions, no matter how positive, if they happen at the wrong time, sometimes undercut the growth of movements. So thinking about that relationship between those two sectors, how would you describe the interplay between politics, the courts, the legislatures, on the one hand, and social movements, protests, on the other? How do you describe the role of those bodies in politics within social change? And if we're not in a moment of going from protest to politics, how do we get there and what's that relationship? So.
Well, in many ways, the United States is unique in the fact that much of the way political conversation, political discourse in this country is framed, to use George Lakoff's phrase, is in the language of rights, and more generally, in the language of law. Right? So our politics is a very legalistic politics. When people articulate their needs, right, and their demands primarily in the language of rights. So for me, it's worth asking, how does rights language empower people politically? How does rights language empower people gathered collectively in social movements? Right? And how does rights language operate as a barrier or an impediment to empowerment of people and social movements? And I don't know that we can say that there's a categorical answer that is true across all contexts and in all situations. But I do believe that the simple fact that we're talking about a civil rights movement today, which at the time understood itself less as a movement aimed at securing legal rights and more as a movement whose mission was to use the language of civil rights to win freedom, right? We've really lost that history. And I think the disconnect between the language of law and the language of rights on the one hand, and the language of social justice, has really served to constrain the ways in which we frame these questions of social justice. And we've got to think our way or talk our way out of that box. Now, Lakoff, as some of you may know who've read his work, says that we think in this country in terms of the society as family. And the genius of the right is that it has mobilized and really captured the language of family, right, in the model of the patriarchal authoritarian family. And that what the left, if there is such a thing in this country, ought to be trying to do is to articulate and promote an alternative vision of what he calls the nurturant family. Right? But he concedes that this language of the family is somehow the ideological terrain on which the battle between the right and left ought to be fought out. And I'm wondering, and here I would put the question to our historian, whether there aren't some alternative ways that we can talk about social relations and social connection that don't start necessarily with the image of the family, but are able to think about human community in terms that are more expansive.
That's a very good question, and just to follow up, I think we were talking about the protest to politics article he written in 63, 65, and in there he talks about the idea of the economy and wealth, and if you really follow this whole entire issue, whether it's civil rights or human rights, it all goes back to the disproportionate absorption of wealth on one side and the lack thereof on the other side. In that very article, he talks about juvenile delinquents and how there are tons of black juvenile delinquents who are trying to obtain the capitalist idea with very innovative and very illegal methods because they realize education has been poor, they're not being included in the overall end game, so they're going to take what is theirs. So I think if we kind of use that model in a sense of renegade behavior, underground economy, and pivot that into a more healthy way of thinking, whether it's selling shoelaces or neckties or whatever it is that's a practical commodity that we all use, that's an opportunity. We have people who are squeegees, washing windows of cars and such like that. So these microeconomic opportunities do exist, and they should eventually, be used, non sequitur. But to get back to your point about the idea of the human family, I can't help but look at the Society of Friends and their theology in a sense of this inner and outer world. Now, we don't have to use the Judeo-Christian model for that. I think if we look to Islam, if we look to Baha'i or Unitarian, you might find similar principles in which you have this inward experience that helps you see the outward world. And I think we're being forced to see that more because the pain, even though most of us might be employed or moneyed or living indoors, can see more people living outdoors, seeing people losing houses. And at some point, you have to not have a pulse to not be pained by seeing that. And on some level, I think irrespective of how we choose to view ourselves in the microcosm, the pain of human suffering is so great that it's going to force us to have a conversation about how do we, as human beings, allow other human beings to experience such deprivation when there is such great opportunity on this side with wealth and not enough for someone on the other side. I forget what CEO just got paid $7.6 million recently as a severance package when the company, it was Bank of America. The stock had gone down, they had to lay people off, but he got a $7.6 million. So how do you live with yourself like that? I mean, 7.6, is that really necessary?
Well, I think you live with yourself very well.
You're so clearly right that the answer to the hard question is both economic and spiritual. To the extent that it's rhetorical, which is what lawyers like to think about, I think I think there are three answers to your really terrific question. And the first one is we've allowed ourselves to get trapped into a rights dialogue in this country where everything is about rights. But then we've allowed ourselves to get trapped into an Isaiah Berlin world in which negative rights are the ones that matter. You can prevent the government from doing things to you, but positive rights are something that that's not really rights. That's something else. And we've accepted it. I mean, the academy has accepted it, the bar has accepted it, philosophers have accepted it, even historians have made they've drawn a radical distinction between the right to housing and the right not to be censored. And somehow the right not to be censored is the road we go down, and the right to housing, that's not a real right. So it seems to me we've got to fight about, we really have to not accept this distinction between negative and positive rights. The second trap, I fell into it because I was a young lawyer and was just totally besotted with the ability to go into court and win cases and do all sorts of things. And I forgot, as many of us forgot, that the rights we were winning were means, not ends. That's right. That winning the right was the means to do what you're talking about as creating freedom. You win the right not to be censored, not because that's valuable in and of itself, but because it leads to a culture and a society in which the voices of the impoverished can't be silenced. And then you get a chance to build the world that you hope that you build. And I can't tell you how many years you win the decree, you put the decree up on your wall, and you think you've done your job. And that's just the beginning. It isn't the end. And the third just response to it is that the idea of this is not new about worrying about yourself and someone else. There is magnificent writing in every single religious tradition about worrying first about yourself, then maybe about your immediate family, then maybe about the next concentric circle out and the next concentric circle out. It's Maimonides. Maimonides started writing about this in the 10th and the 11th century. And there is a philosophical tradition that we don't take advantage of. There's the way to seize from the right the idea that the patriarchal authoritarian family is the organizing principle that we should be imagining our world to be. It's not. It's the concentric circles of human concern that recognize that there may be relative difference in the intensity. I accept that I have a relatively stronger moral obligation to my wife and my children than I do to people whom I've never seen and never met. I accept that because I think that, it's human nature, and I don't think you get to fight against it. But to suggest because you have a stronger relationship with your wife and children than you do with some poor child in Thailand doesn't mean that the poor child in Thailand falls off the earth. I mean, has to be part of your concentric world. And I'd love to figure out ways to rebuilding the rhetoric that would get us to think that way.
Well, Bert, I think one of the ways we do that is precisely by trying to imagine some language that doesn't rely on the language of family and on the ideas of family and kinship. Think, if we want to talk in classical terms, about Aristotle, right? And the model of political society that he offers, which sees the connections between human beings in terms of friendship. Now, the thing about friendship is you're not necessarily related by blood or by the legal ties of family connection to your friend. And in the model of friendship, we're seeing a way to move from the public to the private. My great concern is that this language of family, in effect, tries to mold our public connections, our public life, our public culture, in the image of these effective ties of family. Right? So for me, some very important work needs to be done in breaking out of this privatized model of public life, because I think, in fact, one of the things that makes it possible for members of the Supreme Court to ask with a straight face why we should care about people dying on the street around us because they can't get health care is the fact that they have successfully, the right has successfully persuaded us that we should see public life in the same way, that they've successfully persuaded us that there's a strict line of separation between public and private life, and we should only care about private life. Right?
That's reinforced by the negative rights framework.
Exactly.
That
Makes it
Professor
easier.
Newitz said.
Exactly.
But there is one sector that's...
Say real quickly, the feminist movement article that he had, you going that way? Okay.
No, you go there, and then I'll follow you as best I can.
Okay.
Well, Mr. Rustin was saying in the feminist movement and civil rights, he said it was not going to go very far because the feminists asked for narrow things. So in regards to your negative rights, they asked for abortion rights and some other 3 things they had asked for, and he said that was very good, but they didn't take into the larger situation of health care for the poor, because they were already affluent, they already had husbands, and they had children in daycare, so they didn't see the poverty side of it. So you only can see reality according to your mandates. I mean, unless you've lived another life or are gifted to care about someone else, you only can see reality according to how you process. And I think what Rustin was saying, the activists need to see beyond their actual reality and engage those other communities some way, which is what you're saying,
Right.
to live this kind of private life in a public way in which you might see something that would help you reframe how you're seeing your reality.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
That I think that's a very important thing, that we look at the idea of this economic thing or negative rights. We need to start thinking about the unthinkable. Let's say immigration rights. I'm not Latino, so that doesn't really affect me, but then if those are people that are being basically persecuted, trying to come into a country, legally or illegally, where does their rights come in as human beings on the planet? Not American citizens or, quote, illegals, but when does their human rights, their basic living, breathing mammal rights come in at some point, and why do we not care?
So it's actually not in the case that every sector has rejected positive rights. All the ones you mentioned have. But in fact, nascent but still genuine social movements in the United States have not. There are still communities are still calling for a right to housing and a right to health care. And it's something people at times describe as, rather than rights against, rights in relationship, right? So a rights framework that's not inconsistent with the concept of community, which leads me to my question, which is where I'm going. The Occupy movement. There are strands of human rights rhetoric in it. It's not one voice, but you often see the healthcare as a human right, housing as a human right, economic justice in human rights terms. And you also hear a lot about the need for a renewed democracy, a direct democracy, and community. A lot of the occupiers talk about community, building community in a different way. And as they sat in the encampments, they felt that one of the most important things they were doing was building and modeling a community. So, what do you believe that emerging nascent movement has contributed? What have they failed to contribute? What are their limitations? And how is this Occupy moment similar or different from things we've seen before?
It's a huge question.
Well, you don't have to answer all of it, Professor Thomas.
Right.
Any of it will do.
I can cede my time to you.
Well, it remains to be seen. I think that would be the short answer. But one of the most impressive aspects as an observer of the Occupy movement, to me, is its unapologetic practice of a politics of imagination, right? And its effort to move beyond a politics of pure interest to a politics of solidarity. Right? And the legacy of a politics of solidarity is a very important one. One of the things I wanted to say in my earlier comments is that we can look beyond the borders of the United States, as Professor Newborn has encouraged us to other ways of talking about community. One of the most powerful of which I think we've seen in the last 25 or so years has been the notion made famous globally by Archbishop Desmond Tutu of Ubuntu, which was actually taken up by the Constitutional Court of South Africa in its decision interpreting their interim constitution. This idea that people are people through other people, right? And that the regnant notion in this country that to be a human being is first and foremost to be an individual, and that personhood is about individualism, is a false conception of what human existence is all about, namely that we are bound inextricably to one another in ways that do not impoverish or limit us, but that enrich us individually and as members of the human community. And I think what Occupy Wall Street for those few short days was modeling for us, was enacting, was a politics of imagining human being together as solidarity and not as competition, conflict, and the pursuit of individual interest. Now, where is that going to go? It'll be very interesting to see what unfolds on May Day and the demonstrations that are planned for May Day and after. But I do think that that utopian spirit, which the pragmatist or realist in me sometimes wants to dismiss, speaks to a very powerful yearning that Americans have for connectedness.
Yeah. I mean, again, I mean, I find myself in such agreement with you, but I want to go back a little bit to Mr. Rustin himself. When you talk about solidarity, one of the institutions that has failed us first partly because they were crushed by the government, but also partly because they morally did not live up to what they could be, was the American labor movement, which Rustin cared deeply about. I mean, for him, this was where solidarity was going to grow. I mean, it's no coincidence that, Polish the Polish Union. It's called Solidarity. That solidarity was going to grow from the labor movement outward in a series of ways. And when the labor movement itself turned into a parody of capitalism, with the senior workers protecting themselves against the junior workers and the various unions protecting themselves against each other, it broke my heart. I mean, to watch the movement disintegrate and the moral aspects of the movement disintegrate in front of me, and then see the government power sweep away the rest of them, to the point where we now have such a weak labor movement in this country that one of the ways to start rebuilding solidarity, perhaps, is through that movement. The other way I wanted to say is that when Rustin, or Mr. Oh no, I said it now, he's going to get me. When Mr. Rustin criticized the feminist movement, one of the hopeful signs is that they listened. And the modern feminist movement is worried about economic rights, is worried about poor people around the world in a way that I wish we could replicate in many other settings. Then finally, I'll say about Occupy. Doesn't it strike you as it's astonishing that you had the Tea Party movement followed a year later by Occupy? They are the two manifestations of the bipolar aspect of American life. I mean, the Tea Party movement is acting out everything that you find horrible in this culture. Me too. I mean, individualism, don't care about anybody else, inward-looking, selfishness, no sense of community with anybody except the other people who live in my gated community. That's what community means to them. The word gated goes in front of it. And then you had Occupy, trying with a completely different vision of the way human beings connect to each other and have responsibilities for each other. And my fear is, and this is, maybe this is, I've seen too many movements come and go. My fear is, I don't know what the staying power is of the Occupy idea. The idea is magnificent, and to see it come again and flower for those few short days was wonderful. But maybe, again, this is the grown-up in me. Without a program that can be turned into serious demonstrations, serious politics, this will be an evanescent flame. It'll come up, it'll flare, and it'll be gone. And in 10 years, we'll talk about, gee, do you remember the summer when there was the Occupy movement? So it is so important to support them, to defer to them, because these are young people building a movement, and we don't tell them how to do it. But to remind them that it isn't enough just to have a burst of imagination. You need a program. And that program has to be a program that can be eventually turned into politics, or else it's just not going to work. And the chance is there. I only hope they do it. I only hope they do it.
Well, and alongside that support, I think those of us who are relatively well positioned and respected by virtue of our position in the society need to declare with one uncompromising voice our opposition to a politics and practice on the part of our government and our elected officials that aimed at nothing less than crushing that movement, right, in our name, right, and in maintaining the creeping control over public space of private property and private ownership, right? There's very little possibility of a movement, a grassroots, direct action movement like that growing, right? When you have a government apparatus and, frankly, a police state poised to crush the expression of peaceful opposition to the current state of affairs. And that was heartbreaking to me.
The incredible irony that it took place in a private park.
Yes.
I mean that we've slid so far that it was, because it was a private park, that some of the lawyers were able to flip it, and they had made a negotiated deal with the city that in return for huge tax benefits to whoever donated the land, the notion that it's a private park, I mean, we bought that park. With our tax revenues, because we've given up a huge amount of tax revenues to the developers around there if they would make that park. So there's a park, it's private, they own it. The contract with the city meant that it had to be kept open 24 hours, so they couldn't close it. And that's the way that we were able to fend off closing the park and driving the demonstrators out, the first wave of litigation. And then that finally collapsed, and we weren't able to do it. But you're so right. Until public space is made available so that movements of poor people can organize within the visibility of the society, they will be marginalized all the time. I mean, let me end with just one wonderful story, because you mentioned it, and it reminded me of a Supreme Court argument I had, in which I lost 7-2. And this was about the right of poor people to be able to demonstrate outside the White House by setting up campsites, by demonstrating they had nowhere to live, by setting up essentially Hoovervilles outside of the White House in Lafayette Square. I was making the argument, I was getting killed. And the government lawyer stands up, and Thurgood Marshall says to him, glad to see you, Mr. Solicitor General. Could you tell me how you got here this morning? And the Solicitor General says, I walked, Mr. Justice, I walked. He said, good. Now, when you walked, did you see any homeless people? And the Solicitor General thinks about it. He was a decent guy. Just thinks about it. Says, no, I don't think I did, Mr. Justice. Marshall said to him, they were there. You didn't see them. That's what this case is about, trying to find space where they must be seen. And that, I think, is, I lost 7-2. I mean, Brennan and Marshall were the only 2 votes for that idea. But just because you lose in the Supreme Court doesn't mean the idea isn't right. And that idea is an idea worth fighting for. It's worth fighting for public space where the poor and the dispossessed can gather in ways that we can't close our eyes to. I think that's probably the single, if you ask me what's the single most important right to fight for now, it's the right to be able to create space where Occupy can flourish. And if they do, they won't forget that it's a means, not an ends.
Problem. There's been a rat problem in Washington, both 4- and 2-legged types, for quite some time, so it's not a matter of that, but they said it was a danger to health care. Just I wanted to mention something you had mentioned, and just totally slipped my mind. Oh gosh, I'll have to come back to it. I don't remember, but it was something I was going to say. I totally forgot.
You hold on to that, because we want to make sure we have time for questions, and I have one last question that I just want each of you, if you'd like, to make a brief comment on, so we can move on to questions from the audience. Mr. Rustin had said that he wanted to be the gadfly which has stirred men into action. But one of the obstacles he often faced was his sexual orientation in the movement, not just in the world. So the question is, how did his sexual orientation influence his role as a civil rights agitator, as a humanitarian, as a human rights activist, and his dedication to coalition building? How did that fit in? And each of you want to make maybe a comment before we open it up.
Well, I'll talk about it, the idea of intersectionality. That's the term in which we're saying that society cannot be free if there's any level of ism. So ageism, body shapeism, gender orientation, any ism affects society, and therefore we cannot be a free or totally equal society. So he really is a proto-intersectionalist in a sense that he says, I'm first an African American who happens to have these other kinds of adjectival terms and descriptions. It did not impede him from doing it, but I'm sure ideologically, with the strong Baptist church influence that was leading the movement, definitely ran across some friction. And I'm not sure who said he wasn't a black leader or a Negro leader because he wasn't a head of a Negro organization. So there were all kinds of slights and slurs that were basically thrown publicly that we have documented, and I'm sure privately that we will never know. And I think it informed him in light of his moral compass, which is I can't get away from in regards to the Society of Friends. And that once again, his inner world was strong enough to take those kinds of blows and hits in regards to the greater vision for the outer world.
I don't know how it affected his inner sense of himself as an activist, as an American, as a black man, but I do think it influenced his analysis of injustice. And you can see that in the kind of totalistic, holistic understanding that he had of the interlocking character of systems and practices of political oppression and of social exclusion. He famously said that prejudice is of a single bit. But he came very late in his life to the question of gay-lesbian rights as such. He testified before the New York City Council in the 80s after the adoption of the Human Rights Ordinance to oppose amendments to that legislation. But he did say something quite remarkable in a late interview. He said that in the 1960s, the barometer of people's thinking was the black community. Today, the barometer of where one is on human rights questions is no longer the black, it's the gay community. Now, we might question, as I think many of us in the audience, and certainly I would, the implicit opposition that Rustin draws between the black community and the gay community. Some folks are in both, huh? But I do think that this essential recognition on his part of the extent to which in the 80s, by the 80s, which is when he's speaking, the question of sexuality and the political and social equality of sexual minorities stood at the epicenter of progressive social justice thinking and practice. That insistence, I think, was deeply insightful and deeply courageous for someone who, in many ways, had come of age at a time when sexuality was thought to be essentially a private matter, not for public discussion. And I think he could not help but have had a wounded attachment in many ways to his sexuality, right? Since it had been the thing that had kept him from really being given the recognition and respect that he deserved as such a visionary and one of the chief architects of the African American civil rights movement. So I would say that in many respects, it was with respect to his sexuality that one could see most clearly the ways in which Rustin's imagination and practice as an activist was limited by the historical circumstances in which he lived. But that said, his basic insight about the indivisibility of social struggles, as Martin Luther King put it, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I think Rustin taught King that. And his sexuality, I think, was a very powerful component in that, which is one of the reasons why it is so tragic thinking about the legacy of Rustin, that so much of contemporary African politics, African American politics, and African politics for that matter, seems to be running up against the stumbling block of whether or not the rights of gay men, lesbians, transgendered people, and other sexual minorities are human rights that ought to be accorded the same kind of importance as the human rights claims of African Americans during the civil rights movement of the 60s. That it seems to me, is one of the great tragedies of contemporary African American politics, that it has moved from the high moral vision that King and Rustin embody about the indivisibility of injustice and the fight against injustice, to the moralizing politics that seems to require the demeaning, the denigration, the demonization, in fact, of gay men and lesbians because they somehow pose a threat to the legacy of the civil rights movement.
Well, I'm glad you used the word. I'm not glad. Glad can't be a verb in this. But you used the word tragedy, and that's what I was going to say. The relationship between Mr. Rustin's sexuality and his appalling treatment at the hands of some of the leaders of the civil rights movement of that time was a tragedy. They marginalized him. They wouldn't recognize his remarkable intellectual and moral contribution to the movement. I think, you know, he never broke. He fought like hell all the way, and eventually came to the recognition that the issues of sexuality were at the center of much of the struggle for equality. But from a human perspective, you can only feel sadness for a great leader who was too far ahead of his time for his own people who were standing for equality. I mean, the very movement that stood for equality couldn't stand this additional burden that was being placed on them to seek equality. Now, having said that, I don't want to appear judgmental. I remember what it was like to live there. My very first Supreme Court argument was a 1967 argument in the Supreme Court that challenged the provision in the immigration law that rendered gay, they called them homosexuals in those days in the statute, that rendered gay people excludable aliens on the grounds that they suffered from psychopathic personality. Because the American Psychiatric Association had labeled homosexuality as a form of psychopathic personality. It was viewed as a medical sickness. And that I was challenging it, and so I was about as sympathetic as anybody could be at that point, and I couldn't find a vocabulary in my own heart. I couldn't find a vocabulary to argue in the Supreme Court for equal rights. I argued the definition of psychopathic personality was too vague, and therefore the statute should be struck down on vagueness grounds, because I didn't even have within me the capacity to generate a substantive theory. That came later. And so I don't want to throw stones at the civil rights leaders. It was so difficult to imagine in those years. That's why what both of you said about the importance of unlocking imagination is so important. It's because imagination changed that we're able today to talk seriously about equal rights for people who are who have different sexuality than we do. And it was only imagination that made that possible. The imagination didn't exist when Bayard Rustin was alive. And that is just a tragic, he was too early for his time.
And he wasn't alone. I mean, think about Ella Baker, right, who, and the politics of gender within the civil rights movement. Just imagine what a different legacy we would have today as a people if that movement had recognized the genius of an Ella Baker. I think that, you know, the ongoing struggle that African Americans as a community have with this idea of what Randall Kennedy calls our moral reputation, right? I do think has hampered our ability to imagine a progressive black politics beyond the politics of respectability, right? And my own view is that it has had an injurious impact, not just on gay men and lesbians within the African American community, but on the African American community as a whole in the way that we think about questions of politics and of sexuality and desire as political questions. But I do think with Professor Newborn that the historical context is an important one, and that we ought to view not only Rustin but the generation of which he was a part with some measure of compassion. But that doesn't let us, this contemporary generation, off the hook on these issues.
All right, we are so not off the hook, but shall we open it up?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay. Questions? There's a mic over there. I think is that the only place? Yeah.
Lights up. Lights up.
Hey, good evening. You talk about the Bayard Rustin and about this lack of recognition based on his sexuality, but I was thinking, didn't his sexuality give him a kind of metaphysic, Christ-like triumph in that he persevered and attained despite all of those limitations? And that, I think, then points to some of the difficulty with the Occupy movement, in that they've got this crippling kind of idealism, it seems to me, that where Dr. King and Bayard Rustin were so determined to engage the world in terms of practical politics. And the idealism of the Occupy people, I think, has made them too often feel that they don't want to dirty their hands with the sordid business of politics and are involved in some nobler pursuit which makes them so ineffectual and trivialized, so it seems to me. Then the other thing I wanted to just ask you is, you talked about this idea of the public space, and one of the things that's so disturbing to me is twice I've gone by myself and picketed outside of the mayor's house, and each time been arrested on the public sidewalk. And here in New York City, the center of the free world, because of September the 11th, it said that one cannot picket in front of the mayor's house on the public sidewalk. And that, I think, is something that really has to be challenged, because that is the public space. And so even here in New York, people put up with all kinds of injustice. I mean, if you just look at what happened during the Republican National Convention, where the city is still paying off millions of dollars for people unjustly arrested, because people in New York, respectable middle-class people, a friend said to me, the reason why these things happen here is because people are so happy to have a strong man like Bloomberg, who will guarantee their safety and comfort by having a police state, that they're willing to overlook all of this injustice.
Can we get two at a time, just to make sure we get them all in? And do you want to ask the second one or make a second
Yeah, we'll try to
one?
answer.
Is there a line there, or are you just hanging out?
Sorry. I had a question more so on how to translate the importance of human issue and civil rights issues to the next generation, because everybody here is of a certain age.
How kind.
Me included. But looking around the room, I don't see many children other than my own, and they don't really understand why they're here. But I would like you to speak more in the context of their generation that concentrates on materialism, and how to translate the importance of human rights and civil rights, and how they can take that back to their friends and say, this is something that we need to fight for,
Okay.
and to retain.
Can we start with this question?
You want to mix your question with hers? Okay, a related question?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Because my question was not just a generational thing, but also the idea of academics, the employed, and the community that is underemployed, undereducated, and how movements like Occupy Wall Street are working towards bridging that. How do we reach each other from both of those communities?
All right, so let's take a round of responses, and then we'll get another round of questions, and then can we go? We started late. Can we get a few more minutes past 8:30? No? All right, very brief then.
Right.
I'm getting a no.
Michael, the questions you asked were very important, and they're questions that we should certainly think about, particularly that question about public space. But I want, because you touched my heart in asking this question about the younger generation, to speak to the question that you raised. in New York City, as in many urban cities, young people, Black and Latino youth, men primarily, have disproportionately been targeted by the New York City police in stop and frisk operations. Right? I think some of them have come to see it as normal. Right? If you're young Black or a young Latino man, one of the things that happens to you, or that might happen to you or your friends during the course of the day, is that you're stopped and frisked. And the idea that that is something that simply has to be tolerated as part of life as a young Black or Latino man in this city is outrageous to me, right? Just outrageous to me. And so for me, the question then becomes, what kind of work do those of us who are the mothers and the fathers and the uncles and the aunts and the older cousins of these young people need to take on with them to help raise the consciousness of these young people so that they have a civic identity, right, which allows them to see the injustice of what in hip-hop culture seems to be simply taken for granted. Right? I have some ideas about that. They are connected to a whole range of very specific interventions, intergenerational interventions that I think can be made within the institutions that exist in the Black and Latino community. What I find appalling is that there isn't more and more visible conversation in the Black and Latino public sphere about this, particularly when you connect it to the question of what kind of citizenship these young people are going to imagine themselves as inhabiting 10, 15 years from now. I have a friend who teaches art at one of the schools in Harlem, and he told me that in working with his young students who are 6, 7, 8 years old, he asked them to draw pictures of where they think they're going to be in 10 or 15 years' time. And the number of young African American and Latino kids who draw these images of themselves behind prison bars is just stunning to him, right? That, I think, is an indictment of the criminal character of the government that is supposed to be of, by, and for the people, all the people. So maybe you and I can talk. Maybe the Schomburg can schedule a series of conversations which are focused specifically on the development of youth political culture.
Let's get the last round in quickly. And if there are going to be comments and the guys have questions, make them short.
Well, two questions. At the beginning of the conversation, one of the panelists recharacterized the issue by saying, why can't America make progress in terms of economic and social equality? Now, I feel that one question that is not often part of the debate is, what does that mean for America, not being able to move forward? Because my observation, I'm not American and I've not been living in this country even for a long time, but my observation is that there's a sense that the system you have might not be perfect, but it can work to a certain extent. It can move on. I don't feel that there's a sense of urgency in terms of, if we cannot make progress, then maybe there's a threat for the very political survival or existence of the U.S. or America as a collectivity. And I tend to believe that one factor that can create solidarity or this sense of belonging to one collectivity is a threat that you might lose it and go back to some form of Hobbesian, state of nature. And now my second question is related to the way the discourse is framed in the US in terms of rights. And it seems to me that actually the panelists were only looking at better ways, use of imagination as to how can we use the same framework of rights to advance issues. And I started thinking about somebody like Carl Schmitt. If you would think about the situation as being a situation of crisis, then shouldn't the response to it, or shouldn't the solution be, first of all, a political consensus that would be later on translated in legal terms or in legal discourse?
Let's take one more and then someone else might respond.
Good evening. It was mentioned earlier that the political structure, prevents political organization of the poor and the weak. And then the other item that was talked about was the stone wall and the counterreactions on the right. So my question is, regarding organization, what would that program of, let's say, the Occupy Wall Street movement, what would that look like? And then two, in terms of the power of rhetoric, what would the counterreactions of the left side sound like?
You want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting theme that runs through almost all the questions. By the way, you give New York City much too much credit. It is not the capital of the free world. It's just another place that's got the haves and the have-nots, and the haves usually manage to keep the have-nots away, and that's what's happening to you. I wish it were the capital of the free world. The theme that runs through all of the questions is that there, this is the sad thing, because, when I was younger, Michael Harrington's work about the two Americas was remarkable. It just opened everybody's eyes about the fact that we lived in two different cultures, and one culture was self-satisfied and thought everything was great, and the other culture recognized that it was just horrible, and it was essentially defined by race and by money. The questions you've all been describing is the persistence of the two cultures. You ask a white person in this city about how the police are doing, they're going to tell you, great, great, great. Crime's down, they're doing their stuff. Why? Because their kids aren't being stopped. They don't experience the reality of living as a person of color in a city in which the mayor and the police commissioner have unleashed the police to essentially do preventive stops. That's what they do. Their theory is keep the community off balance, keep pushing, and we'll lower crime. And they do lower crime. I mean, one can't argue that it is completely inefficient, but the cost to the kids who view themselves as living in a second-class world and who can't find their way to break out is just, it's terrifying. I'll tell you the other really depressing things. You want to come home to my apartment, I'll show you the 2 decrees that I won that declare it unconstitutional and tell them they got to stop. I have these decrees, but nobody seems to follow them. The truth is, how do we get the political will to get a mayor who will appoint a police commissioner who will tell his police that we're all equal and we have to be treated the same? So once again, we cycle back to the politics. Last thing was about the program of the, what would change. If you wanted to take 2 things out of here that you could, just to work for change, let me give you 2 ideas that will change things. Will change things. Won't fix things, but will change things. 1, move Election Day from a Tuesday where poor people and employees have to worry about getting time off to vote, so that they have to move it from a Tuesday to Veterans Day. That's a holiday. We all celebrate it. People died to give us the chance to do it. So it's not in the Constitution. That gets moved by an act of Congress. Federal elections on Veterans Day and go to same-day voter registration. When you show up, you show your whatever ID you need, and it shouldn't be these crazy IDs in Florida. You just sort of show who you are, and you get to vote that day. 7 states have it, and the 7 states that have same-day voter registration have an average of 10% higher turnout. If we did that, if we moved the election day to a holiday, and we had same-day voter registration, you would have a 15% spike in turnout in the next election, and they would be the poor people who aren't voting now. And we could maybe tip the balance to have a mayor who says, stop rousting black kids and Latino kids in the streets.
Yeah, and what we're seeing is the exact opposite of that. We are getting legal reforms in the area of voting rights and election law, but it's about restrictions on absentee voting and voting before Election Day, voting on a Sunday. In Florida, for example, in 2008, there was a huge upsurge in voting before Election Day. Souls to the polls, some of you may have heard about some of that work that was done in Florida, where people were taken from church to the polls to vote before the Tuesday Election Day. In 2011, we saw a concerted effort through voter ID laws, through closing the window of opportunity for voting before Election Day and the like, the effort to restrict the opportunities for persons to exercise the franchise, particularly for persons who historically had not voted but came out in such enormous numbers in 2008. I am deeply concerned about what the impact of those laws adopted in 2011 are going to be.
Well, it's working already. It's
of the 2012 elections.
Let's take the last two comments, because they've been patiently standing there, and then we can wrap it up.
All right, I have two questions. I'll try to be very quick. First, I'd like you to comment on the relationship between A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. Even though they were lifetime colleagues, had mutual respect, and even though they differed tactically, as happened in 1941 over whether the march should be called off or not, it was Randolph who insisted that Bayard become the chief organizer of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom as a condition for his agreeing to be chair, who stood by Bayard when he was attacked by Strom Thurmond on the floor of the United States Senate as being a communist, draft dodger, and pervert. Secondly, the civil rights movement, in which Bayard played such a major role as a brilliant strategist and master tactician, was not only a grassroots movement in the 50s and 60s, but had a program and was engaged in politics that ended up getting a response from the White House and the Congress. What should that movement's program and political engagement be today?
Okay, let's take the second one. Are you gonna?
Oh, you want the second question?
Yes.
Yes, because this is it. You're the last one.
Okay. Let me just, first of all, congratulate the Schomburg Cultural Center and the American Constitutional Committee or Society for this conference. I think it's very important. My name is Velma Hill, and I, along with the person who just spoke, Norm Hill, was one of those who were mentored by Bayard Rustin. And it's so important that the country understand the significant role that he played. And I think that we need to have more of this all around, not just the Black community, but for the whole community. Now, you mentioned the protest to politics, and I think that was one of the important documents for that period, and it's still important today. And what protest to politics was saying was not just not stop demonstrating, but move to politics along with some kinds of demonstrating. For instance, going to the polls, marching to the polls is demonstrating. And that's what Bayard was talking about. Getting more Blacks elected in Congress, it will change the complexion of the country. And to do that, You need to be out on the street, because that's what he talked about, being out on the street. And you know, Bayard was an optimist. No matter what happened to him, with his sexuality, with his being told by Adam Clayton Powell to disappear from King, or he would imply that they were having an affair. And you know, he had a lot of things happen to him. But you know what? Even though he had some periods where he was despondent, basically he was an optimist. And I think today he would say what the Randolph Institute people are saying today, which is to the Occupy people, that's very important, but you gotta have a program. Like he whispered in Martin Luther King's ear, he would be whispering in their ear, saying that you gotta combine with gays, with minorities, with the religious community, with the labor movement, and you gotta push Congress. You gotta get a good Congress, and then when you get a good Congress, you gotta push them with your program. And that includes our black president. You gotta push him too. Everybody has to be pushed from below. And I think that's what he would be saying. And I just would like to hear your comments about my comments. Could you please give me a response?
You're gonna have to hear it a little bit after we get off the stage, because we've run out of time. But I think you've just given us a wonderful summary and closing. And now, that's not to say you can't jump them as soon as they get off the stage. But I think throughout the conversation, you hear echoes of the same theme. We need a vision, and we need a program. And each of us is responsible for building it. We are the ones we are waiting for. We can't keep waiting for someone else to do it. And if nothing else, we know that Mr. Rustin would have said that today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.